They priced her like livestock under a sky that offered no shade, and not a single man in that dusty circle saw a human being standing there. The sun hung high over the trading post, heat pressing down like a hand on the back of every neck, and the smell of leather, sweat, and dry earth clung to the air, so thick it felt like breathing through cloth. Iana stood in the center of it all, her feet planted in the dirt, her shoulders straight, her eyes steady in a way that unsettled the men more than if she had cried. Someone laughed from the edge of the crowd, a sharp, careless sound. "Strong build," he said. "Good for bearing children." A few others nodded, not cruel in their tone, just practical, as if discussing a horse or a stretch of land. Another man stepped closer, squinting at her in the harsh light, then shook his head and stepped back again. "Not worth the trouble," he muttered. And just like that, the judgment passed. No shouting, no drama, just quiet dismissal. Iana did not move. In her right hand, half hidden against the folds of her dress, her fingers curled tightly around a small silver necklace, its surface worn smooth by years of touch. It was the only thing she had not been able to leave behind, the only thing that still felt like it belonged to her, and not to the world that kept trying to define her. The metal was warm now from her skin, but she held it anyway, as if it could anchor her in place while everything else slipped away. Around her, boots shifted in the dust. Deals were being made nearby, cattle exchanged, supplies counted, voices rising and falling in the rhythm of frontier trade. Life went on, indifferent. Iana had learned long ago that silence was safer than pleading. So she stood and waited, not for someone to choose her, just for it to be over. Then the sound of hooves drifted in from the far end of the road, slow, unhurried, cutting through the noise without asking permission. A few heads turned. Most didn't bother. Riders came and went all the time. But this one didn't ride past. The horse stopped at the edge of the circle, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then a man swung down from the saddle, boots hitting the ground with a soft, deliberate thud. He didn't push forward right away, didn't call out. He just stood there, taking in the scene with a kind of stillness that felt out of place in a town built on motion. Ethan Cole had the look of someone who had spent more time alone than among crowds. Dust clung to his coat, his hat cast a shadow over his eyes, and there was nothing flashy about him, nothing that demanded attention. And yet, slowly, attention found him anyway. The man who had been speaking earlier glanced over. "You buying?" he asked, half out of habit, half out of curiosity. Ethan didn't answer. His gaze had already moved past the speaker, past the others, and settled on Iana. Not on her posture, not on the way she stood, or the way the sun traced the lines of her silhouette. He looked at her face, at her eyes, and then, almost without meaning to, his focus dropped to her hand, to the silver glint barely visible between her fingers. Something shifted. It was small, easy to miss, but it was there. He took a step forward. The circle adjusted, giving him space more out of instinct than respect. $40, someone said again, as if repeating it might make it more real. Ethan reached into his coat, pulled out the money, and held it out without a word. No bargaining, no hesitation. The bills changed hands, and just like that, the transaction was done. A few men chuckled. One shook his head. "Didn't think anyone would take her," he said. "Guess everyone's got a use." Ethan ignored them. He stepped closer to Iana, close enough now that he could see the fine dust on her skin, the tension in her jaw, the way her fingers tightened just slightly around that necklace when he approached. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The world around them faded to a dull hum. Then, quietly, almost as if he wasn't sure he should ask, Ethan said, "That necklace, where did you get it?" The question landed differently than anything else that had been said that day. Not an assessment. Not a price. Iana's eyes flickered, just once, a crack in the stillness she had held so carefully. She didn't answer right away. And for the first time since she had stepped into that circle, something like uncertainty moved through her. Ethan didn't press. He simply waited, his gaze steady, not demanding, not turning away. Somewhere behind them, a deal was sealed with a handshake. Somewhere else, laughter rose and fell again. But in that small pocket of space between them, something had already begun to change, though neither of them could have named it yet, and the silver necklace, warm in her hand, seemed suddenly heavier than it had a moment before. The road out of town stretched long and pale under the afternoon sun, a ribbon of dust that seemed to lead nowhere in particular, and for a while, neither of them spoke as the sound of the horse's steady hooves filled the silence between them, measured and calm, like the kind of rhythm a man learns to trust after too many years of listening to his own thoughts. Ayanna sat behind Ethan, not holding on to him, not leaning forward, keeping a careful distance even on the narrow saddle, her balance steady, her presence quiet, as if she had learned how to take up as little space as possible in a world that never made room for her. And Ethan did not turn around to look at her, did not ask questions the way other men might have, because something in the way she had stood back there in the dust told him that questions, when asked the wrong way, could feel like another kind of chain. The town faded behind them, its noise dissolving into the open land where the wind moved freely and the air smelled cleaner, touched with sage and dry grass. And only when the buildings were no longer visible did Ethan finally speak again. His voice low, carried back to her over his shoulder. "You do not have to answer if you do not want to," he said, pausing just long enough to let the words settle. "But that necklace, it matters." And the way he said it was not like a man asking out of curiosity. It sounded like something closer to recognition, like a memory that had not yet fully taken shape. Ayanna's fingers tightened again around the silver, and for a moment she considered saying nothing at all, letting the silence swallow the question the way it had swallowed so many others in her life. But there was something different about this man, not kindness exactly. Not yet, but a kind of restraint that felt unfamiliar, and unfamiliar things, she had learned, could be dangerous or they could be the only chance a person ever got. "It was my mother's," she said finally, her voice steady but quiet, "and used to being invited into the open air like this. She told me it came from someone she helped a long time ago." Ethan's grip on the reins shifted almost imperceptibly, the leather creaking softly under his hand, and though he kept his eyes forward, something in his posture changed, a tension that had not been there before, as if a piece of a puzzle he had carried for years had suddenly been placed in front of him without warning. "Did she ever say who?" he asked, careful now, each word chosen with more weight than the last, and Ayanna shook her head, though he could not see it. "No names," she said. "Only that the woman was sick, and alone, and far from her own people." The wind picked up slightly, lifting strands of her dark hair and carrying them back across Ethan's shoulder, and for a brief second, the scent of smoke and sage brushed past him, faint but unmistakable, and it pulled something loose in his memory, something old and quiet, like a voice he had not heard in years. "She said the woman would have died if no one found her." Ayanna continued, her gaze fixed on the horizon ahead, though she was not really seeing it, and that helping her change something. She hesitated then, just a fraction, as if stepping into a place she had not spoken about before. She said some debts do not belong to the person who receives the help. Ethan let out a slow breath, the kind a man does not realize he has been holding, and the land opened up before them in a wide stretch of golden shadow, the sun beginning its slow descent toward the hills in the distance, casting long lines across the ground that made everything look both sharper and softer at the same time. They rode like that for another mile, maybe two, the ranch coming into view at last, a modest place set back from the road, with a weathered fence, a small barn, and a house that looked like it had been built to last rather than to impress. And as they approached, Ayanna's eyes moved over it carefully, taking in every detail the way someone does when they are trying to understand where they have been brought, not as a guest, not as a partner, but as something that had been purchased, even if the man who had done the buying had not treated her like it. Ethan brought the horse to a stop near the porch, then dismounted in one smooth motion, his boots hitting the ground with a quiet finality. And for a moment he just stood there, looking at the house, as if making a decision he had already made but still needed to acknowledge. Then he turned and offered his hand up to her, not reaching, not pulling, simply holding it there in the space between them, an option rather than a command. And Ayanna looked at that hand, at the distance between them, and then at his face, searching for something she could name, something she could trust, and finding instead only that same steady restraint. She took his hand, light but certain, and stepped down from the horse, her feet touching the ground of a place that did not yet belong to her, and maybe never would. And for a brief moment, neither of them moved, the air between them quiet, carrying the weight of everything that had not yet been said. Ethan released her hand first, not quickly, not reluctantly, just when it was time, and he gestured toward the house with a small motion. "There is water inside," he said, "and food." He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "But not quite. You can stay as long as you need." Ayana studied him for a moment longer, the silver necklace now resting against her palm, no longer hidden, and somewhere deep inside, something shifted, not enough to be called hope, not yet, but enough to feel the difference between being taken somewhere and being allowed to arrive. The house held its silence like it had been waiting for years and did not know what to do now that it had been broken. The door creaking softly as Ethan pushed it open and stepped aside, letting Ayana enter first, not as a gesture meant to impress, but as something simpler, something that came from a place that did not need to be explained. Inside, the air was cooler, shaded from the late afternoon sun, carrying the faint scent of wood, dust, and something older, something lived in, and Ayana paused just past the doorway, her eyes adjusting, taking in the space with the same careful attention she had given everything else. The table near the window, the iron stove in the corner, the shelves lined with tools and small objects that spoke of a life built one piece at a time, nothing wasted, nothing unnecessary. She had expected something different, though she could not have said exactly what. Perhaps a place that felt like a holding pen, or a space that reminded her of what she had just left behind. But there was no sign of that here, no sign of anyone trying to claim ownership over her presence, and that absence, more than anything, unsettled her. Ethan moved past her quietly, setting his hat down on a hook by the door, then crossing to a small basin where he poured water from a tin pitcher, the sound of it steady and clear. "You can wash," he said, not turning around, not watching her, giving her the kind of privacy that did not ask permission but offered it anyway. And Ayana hesitated for a moment before stepping forward, placing the necklace carefully on the table beside the basin, her fingers lingering on it just long enough to feel its shape before letting go. The water was cool against her skin, and for a brief second, the simple act of washing the dust from her hands felt like something more than it should have been, like a line being drawn between what had happened that morning and where she stood now. And she found herself moving slower than necessary, not because she needed the time, but because she did not yet understand what would come after it. Behind her, Ethan moved through the room with quiet purpose, setting a kettle on the stove, gathering bread from a cloth on the counter. The motions of someone who had done these things alone for a long time, without interruption, without needing to explain himself to anyone. And yet now, there was a second presence in the room, and he adjusted to it not with words, but with small changes in how he moved, how he set things down, how he left space where there had been none before. "There is a room in the back," he said after a moment, his voice even, steady. "It has a bed, clean sheets." He paused, as if considering something, then added, "It is yours if you want it." The words hung in the air between them, simple, but carrying a weight that neither of them ignored, and Ayana dried her hands slowly, turning to face him, studying his expression, looking for the expectation that usually followed such an offer, the unspoken condition that always came with shelter, with food, with any kind of kindness in a place like this. But she did not find it, and that absence made her chest tighten in a way she did not expect. "Why?" she asked, the word quiet but direct, not accusing, not grateful, just honest, and Ethan met her gaze, not surprised by the question, as if he had been waiting for it. "Because you are here," he said simply, then after a brief moment, "and because you should not have to stand outside." It was not a complete answer, not the one she had asked for, but it was not a deflection either, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet settling again, not heavy, but not light either, something in between, something that required patience to understand. Ayana glanced down at the necklace resting on the table, its silver catching the last of the sunlight coming through the window, and she picked it up again, turning it over in her hand. "You asked about this," she said, more statement than question, and Ethan nodded once, his eyes following the movement. "My mother said the woman who gave it to her had a son," she continued, her voice steady, though something beneath it had shifted, something closer to curiosity than before. "She said he was small and quiet, and that he watched everything." Ethan let out a slow breath, the sound almost lost under the faint crackle of the stove as the fire caught, and he took a step closer, not too close, just enough to bridge the distance without closing it entirely. My mother used to tell a story, he said, his voice lower now, not for effect, but because the memory required it, about a woman who found her when no one else would, who stayed when it would have been easier to leave. His eyes moved to the necklace, then back to Ayana. She said that woman carried something silver, something she never took off. The room seemed to hold that moment, the air still, the light fading just enough to soften the edges of everything around them. And Ayana felt the weight of the necklace in her hand change, not in size, not in shape, but in meaning, as if it had just been given a second story to carry. My grandmother, she said quietly, the realization settling into place not all at once, but in pieces that fit together, whether she wanted them to or not. And Ethan nodded. Once, the motion small but certain, she saved my mother's life, he said, not with gratitude that demanded recognition, but with a kind of quiet acknowledgement that had been waiting for this moment longer than he had known. Ayana looked at him then, really looked, not as the man who had stood in that circle and paid a price, but as someone who had been standing in the shadow of a debt he did not create. And for the first time since she had arrived, the space between them did not feel like something to measure, but something that had already been crossed in a way neither of them had planned. And outside, the light slipped lower over the land, the ranch settling into evening, carrying with it the quiet understanding that whatever this place had been before, it was no longer just one man's solitude. The evening settled over the ranch like a slow breath, the kind that did not rush and did not ask permission, and the last light stretched long across the wooden floor before slipping away inch by inch, leaving the room wrapped in a quiet that felt different now, not empty, not heavy, just present. And Ayana sat at the small table with the silver necklace resting in her palm, turning it once, then again, as if each movement might reveal something new that had always been there, but never fully understood. Across from her, Ethan poured water into 2 cups, the simple act steady and deliberate, and he set one near her without a word, not watching to see if she would take it, because he had already decided that what she chose to do with it was hers alone, and that small distance, that refusal to guide or control, lingered between them like something neither of them had words for yet. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass, brushing against the walls with a soft, whispering sound, and somewhere in the distance, a horse shifted in the barn, the faint creak of wood answering back, the ranch speaking in its own quiet language that had long been meant for one person only, and now, for the first time in years, it carried a second presence. You knew, Ayana said after a while, her voice low, not accusing, not surprised, just certain, and Ethan nodded once, his gaze steady on the table rather than on her, as if the truth did not need to be delivered through eye contact to be understood. Not at first, he said, then after a pause. Only when I saw the necklace. He lifted his hand slightly, not pointing, just acknowledging it. My mother described it so many times I thought I would recognize it anywhere. Ayana let that settle, her fingers tracing the edge of the silver, the smoothness worn by years of touch that had now passed from one life to another, carrying a story neither of them had chosen but both of them now held. Then why did you not say it there? She asked, her eyes lifting to meet his, searching not for explanation, but for something deeper, something that would tell her whether this was about obligation or something else entirely. And Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, the wood creaking under the shift. Because out there, he said slowly, choosing each word as if it had weight, they would have heard a reason, not a truth. He paused, then added, and I did not want you to feel like a reason. The words did not come with emphasis, but they settled into the space between them with more force than if he had raised his voice. And Ayana felt something in her chest tighten again, not from fear this time, but from the unfamiliar shape of being seen without being defined. The fire in the stove crackled softly, casting a warm glow that moved along the walls, shifting shadows that made the room feel alive in a quiet, steady way. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence no longer something to fill, but something to sit inside, something that did not demand to be broken. Ayana looked down again at the necklace, then carefully, almost deliberately, She lifted it and placed it on the table between them. Not hidden, not held close, just there, in the open, and the gesture was small, but it carried a meaning that neither of them missed, and Ethan's gaze followed it, then lifted back to her face, not questioning, not interpreting, simply acknowledging what had been offered without asking for it. My grandmother said something once. Ayana said, her voice softer now, but steady, she said, that when you help someone, you do not choose how the story ends. She paused, her eyes moving briefly to the window where the last light had faded completely, leaving only the reflection of the room looking back at her. She said sometimes it comes back in a way you do not recognize. Ethan let out a quiet breath, the kind that carried both understanding and something like acceptance. My mother said the same thing, he replied, and there was something in his voice now that had not been there before, something closer to release than to memory. Outside, the night settled fully, the sky deep and wide, stars beginning to appear one by one, steady and distant, and the ranch grew still, the kind of stillness that came not from absence, but from things being exactly where they were meant to be, at least for this moment. Ayana leaned back slightly in her chair, her posture no longer as rigid as it had been when she first stepped into the house, not relaxed, not yet, but no longer held in, placed by something she could not name, and she looked at Ethan again, not as the man who had stood in that circle, not as the one who had paid a price, but as someone who had chosen something else entirely, something that did not fit into the patterns she had known. What happens now? She asked, the question simple, but carrying everything that had not yet been decided, and Ethan did not answer right away, not because he did not have an answer, but because he understood that whatever came next could not be decided in a single sentence, not in a way that would mean anything. He stood then, moving to the window, looking out into the dark where the outline of the land stretched beyond what the eye could follow, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, but certain. Now, he said, nothing happens that you do not choose, and the words did not sound like a promise. They sounded like something stronger, something that did not need to be repeated to be real, and behind him, on the table, the silver necklace lay between them, no longer just a memory, no longer just a debt, but something else entirely, something that had begun to change the shape of both their lives without either of them needing to force it. Morning came slowly across the ranch, not with noise, but with light, a pale gold that crept over the horizon and stretched across the land as if it had all the time in the world, and inside the house, the quiet remained, softer now, less uncertain, as if the walls themselves had accepted the presence of something new. Ayana woke before the sun fully rose, her eyes opening to a space that did not feel unfamiliar anymore, though she had only been there for a single night, and for a moment she lay still, listening, the faint sound of wind moving across the plains, the distant shift of hooves from the barn, and beneath it all, a steadiness she had not known how to name before, a kind of calm that did not ask anything from her. She sat up slowly, the blanket falling back from her shoulders, and her gaze moved across the room, taking in the simple bed, the wooden walls, the small window where the first light was beginning to gather. And then her hand moved instinctively to the necklace, resting beside her, her fingers closing around it with a familiarity that felt different now, not just memory, but connection. In the main room, Ethan was already awake, standing near the stove with a tin cup in his hand, watching the light as it filled the space inch by inch, and when he heard her step behind him, he did not turn immediately, giving her the same quiet respect he had given the night before, allowing her presence to arrive without being announced. "There is coffee," he said. After a moment, his voice low, even, as if the morning itself required that kind of tone, and Ayana stepped forward, the floorboards soft beneath her feet, the air carrying the faint warmth of the stove, and she accepted the cup. He sat on the table, her fingers brushing the edge of it, feeling the heat seep into her skin. They did not speak much after that, not because there was nothing to say, but because neither of them rushed to fill the space, and the silence between them had begun to change, no longer something to endure, but something to share. After a while, Ethan moved toward the door, reaching for his hat. "There is work to do," he said simply, glancing back at her just once. "You do not have to," and the words hung there, not as instruction, not as expectation, just an opening, and Ayana considered them for a moment. then set the cup down, the decision forming without struggle. "I will help," she said, and there was no hesitation in her voice, no need to justify it. Just a choice made because it was hers to make. Outside, the air was cool, the kind that carried the promise of heat later in the day, and the land stretched wide and open, the ranch quiet but alive, the fences casting long shadows, the barn standing steady against the horizon. And as they walked side by side, not too close, not too far, Ayana felt something shift again, something small but certain, the difference between being brought somewhere and choosing to step into it. Ethan showed her the work without explanation, not because he assumed she knew, but because he trusted that she would learn in her own way, and she did, her movements careful at first, then steadier, her hands adjusting to the rhythm of the tasks. The weight of the tools, the quiet language of the land that did not need words to be understood. Time moved differently out there, marked not by clocks, but by the position of the sun, the length of shadows, the slow passing of moments that did not demand attention but held it anyway. And by midday, the air had warmed, the scent of dry grass rising around them, the sound of wind carrying across the open space. And they paused near the fence line, the work set aside for a moment that did not feel like a break, but like something earned. Ayana rested her hand against the rough wood, her gaze moving out over the land, and for the first time, she did not feel like she was standing on the edge of something that could disappear beneath her feet, and beside her, Ethan stood with the same quiet stillness he had always carried. But there was a difference now, subtle, but real. The space between them no longer measured in distance, but in something else, something that had begun to take shape without either of them forcing it. "You could leave," he said after a while, not looking at her, his voice steady. "If you wanted to." And the words were not a dismissal, not a suggestion, just a truth offered without weight. And Ayana turned her head slightly, studying him, the line of his shoulders, the way he held himself as if the land and the silence were enough. And she shook her head once, a small movement, but certain. "Not yet," she said, and there was something in those two words that carried more than their sound, something that spoke of time, of choice, of something that was no longer being taken from her, but given back piece by piece. The wind moved again, brushing past them, lifting the edges of her hair, and for a moment, the world felt larger than it had the day before, not because it had changed, but because she had, just enough to notice. And as they stood there, the ranch stretching out before them, the sun high overhead, the quiet holding steady, it became clear that whatever this place had been when she arrived, it was no longer just a refuge. It was becoming something else, something neither of them had planned, but neither of them turned away from. The afternoon stretched long and quiet, the kind of quiet that settles deep into the bones of a place. And by the time the sun began its slow descent, the rhythm of the ranch had already woven itself into something steady, something that did not ask for attention but held it anyway. And Ayana moved through it now with a familiarity that had not been there the day before, her steps more certain, her hands no longer hesitating when they met the work, as if the land itself had begun to accept her presence without question. Ethan watched this without making it known, his gaze passing over her only in brief moments, not to measure, not to judge, but to understand, and there was something in the way she carried herself now that reminded him of stories his mother used to tell, not about strength that demanded to be seen, but about the kind that lived quietly, the kind that did not need recognition to be real. The sun dipped lower, casting the world in a warm, fading gold, and they returned to the house without speaking, the silence between them no longer uncertain, but shared, like a path they both understood without needing to name it. Inside, the air held the day's warmth, and Ayana moved to the table, setting down the tools she had carried in, her fingers brushing against the wood as if grounding herself in something that felt increasingly steady. And Ethan stepped toward the window, looking out over the land as he had done so many evenings before. But this time, the view felt different, not because the land had changed, but because it was no longer only his. "They will talk," Ayana said after a while, her voice quiet but clear, not heavy with fear, just certain, and Ethan nodded. Once, not turning. "They always do," he replied, and there was no bitterness in his tone, only a recognition of something that did not need to be challenged to be understood. Ayana looked down at her hands, the faint marks of the day's work still visible, and for a moment, she let the thought settle, not as something to avoid, but as something to face. They will say you bought me. She continued, her words measured. And this time Ethan turned, his gaze meeting hers directly, steady and unflinching. They can say what they want, he said, his voice even. It does not make it true. And the simplicity of it carried more weight than any argument could have, because it did not try to change the world. It simply refused to be shaped by it. The light in the room shifted again as the sun slipped lower, shadows stretching across the floor, and Ayana reached for the necklace on the table, lifting it slowly, her fingers tracing its surface with a familiarity that had deepened, not just memory now, but meaning, and she looked at Ethan, not with hesitation, but with something steadier, something that had begun to take root. Where I come from, she said, her voice softer now, but carrying a quiet strength. A debt like this does not end with a single act. Ethan held her gaze, not interrupting, not filling the space, and she continued. It becomes part of both lives. The words lingered between them, not as a question, not as a demand, but as something that needed to be acknowledged, and Ethan nodded slowly, the motion small but certain. I know, he said, and for a moment, that was all that needed to be said. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, moving across the plains with a low, steady sound, and the first hint of night began to settle, the sky deepening, the air cooling, and inside the house, the fire in the stove flickered to life again, its glow soft and steady, casting light that did not push the darkness away, but coexisted with it. Ayana stepped closer to the table. Then, without hesitation, she placed the necklace around her neck, the silver resting against her skin where it belonged, and the gesture was quiet, but it carried a finality that neither of them missed, a recognition that whatever this connection was, it was no longer something held in the past. It was here, present, shaping the moment as it unfolded. Ethan watched her for a second, then looked away, not out of discomfort, but out of respect, as if the act itself was something that did not need to be witnessed to be understood, and he moved toward the stove, adding another piece of wood to the fire, the small crackle filling the space with a warmth that felt earned rather than given. Tomorrow, he said after a moment, his voice steady. I have to go into town. And the words settled into the room with a quiet weight, because both of them understood what that meant without needing to explain it. And Ayana did not respond right away, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, as if she was measuring something unseen, not the distance, not the risk, but the choice itself. Then I will go with you, she said finally, her voice calm, not defiant, not hesitant, just clear, and Ethan turned slightly, his eyes meeting hers again, searching not for permission, but for certainty, and he found it there, steady and unshaken, and he nodded once, not because he needed to agree, but because he understood that this was no longer something he decided alone. The fire crackled softly, the night settled fully around the ranch, and in the quiet that followed, it became clear that whatever had begun between them was no longer contained within the walls of the house or the boundaries of the land. It was moving outward, toward a world that would not understand it, would not accept it easily, and yet, neither of them stepped back from that path, because for the first time, the direction ahead was not something chosen for them. It was something they were willing to walk into together. The morning they rode back toward town carried a different kind of weight, not heavy, not sharp, but present in the way the air seemed to hold still just a little longer before the wind moved through it, and the land stretched wide and open ahead of them as it had the day before. But this time, it did not feel like something distant. It felt like something they were crossing together, step by step, without needing to speak about it. Ayana rode behind Ethan again, her hands steady, her posture no longer held back by hesitation, and the silver necklace rested against her chest, catching the early light with each movement of the horse, a small, quiet reminder of something that had already begun to change more than either of them had expected. The closer they came to town, the more the silence shifted, not breaking, but tightening slightly, as if the world ahead was already aware of their approach, and Ethan felt it too, though he did not show it, his shoulders steady, his gaze fixed. Forward, the the same way he had ridden into that place so many times before. But this time, there was no sense of routine in it, no sense of familiarity that made things easier. The first buildings came into view slowly, rising from the dust and heat. The same wooden structures, the same narrow street, the same place where voices gathered and judgments formed long before truth ever had a chance to arrive. And as they entered the edge of town, a few heads turned, not all at once, not dramatically, but enough to be noticed, enough to mark the moment. Ayana felt the shift immediately, not because anyone said anything, but because she had lived long enough to recognize the way attention could settle on a person without needing words, and she did not look away, did not lower her gaze. She simply rode forward, steady, the necklace resting where it could be seen, not hidden, not explained. Ethan guided the horse to a stop near the general store, the same place where deals were made and broken in quiet ways, and he dismounted first, then turned, offering his hand as he had before, not as something new, not as something performed, just as something that had already become part of how he moved. And Ayana took it, stepping down beside him, her feet meeting the ground of the same town that had looked at her differently only a day before. For a moment, nothing happened, and that silence carried more tension than any raised voice could have, because it held the weight of expectation, of what people believed they already knew, and what they were waiting to confirm. Someone near the store shifted, clearing his throat, and another man leaned against the post, watching with a kind of quiet curiosity that was not friendly, but not openly hostile either, just measuring, just waiting. "You came back," one of them said finally, the words directed at Ethan, but not entirely about him, and Ethan nodded once, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just standing where he was. "I did," he replied, his voice even, carrying no more and no less than what was needed. The man's eyes moved to Ayana, then to the necklace, then back again, and there was something in that glance that searched for confirmation, for the story he had already decided was true. But Ayana did not give it to him. She did not react, did not explain. She simply stood, her presence steady in a way that made the silence stretch a little longer than expected. "You planning to keep her?" Another voice asked from somewhere behind them, casual in tone, but not careless, and Ethan's gaze shifted slightly, not toward the speaker, but toward the space between them, as if the question itself did not deserve to be faced directly. "No," he said, and the word landed clearly, without hesitation, without room for interpretation. "She is not something to keep." The quiet that followed was different from before, not uncertain, but unsettled, as if something had been said that did not fit into the pattern everyone else had been expecting. Ayana felt it then, the shift, small but real, and she did not step back from it, did not shrink from the attention that came with it. Instead, she moved forward just slightly, enough to stand beside Ethan rather than behind him, and the gesture was subtle, but it changed the shape of the moment in a way that no words could have. The man by the post let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but not quite, and he shook his head. "You always were strange, Cole," he said, but there was less certainty in his voice now, less of the easy judgment that had come before, and Ethan did not respond, because he did not need to. The truth of what he had said was already standing there, visible to anyone willing to see it. Ayana turned her head slightly, taking in the faces around them, the expressions that shifted between confusion, curiosity, and something quieter, something that had not yet decided what it was, and for the first time, she did not feel like she was standing in the center of someone else's story. She felt like she was standing in her own. The wind moved through the street, carrying dust in soft, low swirls, brushing against the edges of coats and boots, and the moment passed not with a resolution, but with a quiet understanding that something had changed, even if no one could fully name it yet. Ethan reached for the reins again, not rushing, not lingering, and Ayana stayed where she was for a second longer, her hand resting lightly against the necklace, the silver warm against her skin, and then she turned back toward him, her steps steady, her presence certain, and as they moved forward together into the town that had once defined her without knowing her, it became clear that whatever waited ahead would not be decided by the voices around them, but by the choices they had already begun to make. The town did not return to normal after that moment, even though no one said it out loud. and as Ethan and Ayanna stepped away from the general store, the air followed them with a quiet kind of attention that lingered longer than it should have, like dust that refused to settle, and the usual sounds of the place, boots on wood, low voices trading goods, the creak of wagon wheels, all continued, but underneath it, something had shifted. Something that did not belong to habit anymore. Ayanna walked beside Ethan now, not behind him, not half a step back, but even, her stride steady, her gaze forward, and the silver necklace rested against her collarbone where the light could find it. Not hidden, not explained, just present, and each step she took across that street felt different from the last time she had stood there, because this time, she was not waiting to be chosen. She was choosing where she stood. They moved past the storefront slowly, not in a hurry, because there was no reason to rush, and Ethan stopped near the supply post, reaching for a coil of rope, checking its weight with practiced hands, the kind of movement that had nothing to do with the people watching and everything to do with the life he had built long before this day. And Ayanna stood beside him, her eyes moving across the space, taking in the details, the faces, the small shifts in posture and expression that told her more than words ever could. A woman near the doorway of the store glanced at her, then at the necklace, then back again, and there was something in that look that was not quite judgment, not quite curiosity, something in between, something that had not yet decided what it wanted to be, and Ayanna met it without flinching, not challenging, not inviting, simply present in a way that did not leave room for easy answers. You do not have to stay close, Ethan said quietly after a moment, not looking at her directly, his voice low enough that it did not carry beyond them. You can move as you want. And the words were not a warning, not a suggestion, just a reminder of something he had already given her. And Ayanna turned her head slightly, considering him, the line of his shoulders, the steadiness in the way he held himself even under the weight of the eyes around them. And she shook her head once, a small motion, but clear. I am where I choose to be, she said, and there was no tension in her voice, no need to prove it, just a truth spoken plainly. Ethan nodded once, accepting it without question, and returned his attention to the rope, paying for it without discussion. The exchange quick, ordinary, as if nothing around them had changed at all, and yet everything had. They stepped away from the post, moving toward the edge of town where the road opened back into the wide stretch of land, and for a moment, it seemed like the town would let them go without another word, without another glance. But just as they reached the last row of buildings, a voice called out, not loud, not harsh, but clear enough to stop them. Cole, the man said, and Ethan paused, turning just enough to acknowledge the call without fully stepping back, and the man approached slowly, not with aggression, not with ease, but with something measured, something that carried its own kind of weight. You always did things your own way, he said, his eyes moving briefly to Ayanna, then back to Ethan. But this is not the same. And there was no accusation in his tone, not exactly, just a statement that hovered between concern and disbelief, as if he was trying to understand something that did not fit into the shape he expected. Ethan held his gaze, not defensive, not dismissive, just steady. No, he said, it is not. And the simplicity of the answer left no space for argument, because it did not try to justify itself. It only acknowledged what was already true. The man studied him for a moment longer, then glanced at Ayanna again, his expression shifting, not softening, but changing in a way that suggested something was beginning to move beneath the surface, something that had not been there before, and he gave a small nod, more to himself than to them, before stepping back, the moment passing without resolution, but not without effect. Ayanna watched this exchange carefully, her attention fixed not on the words, but on what lay beneath them, the quiet shift in tone, the absence of certainty, and she felt something settle inside her, something that did not come from the town, but from within, a recognition that the space she stood in now was no longer defined by what others expected, but by what she chose to carry forward. They turned then, continuing toward the open road, the sounds of the town fading behind them with each step, and the land ahead stretched wide and unbroken, the wind moving freely across it, carrying with it the scent of dust and grass, and something else, something that felt like possibility, though neither of them would have named it that. Ethan adjusted the reins in his hand, the leather familiar against his palm, and Ayanna walked beside him, her pace steady, her presence certain, and for a while, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing that needed to be said, not yet, not in a way that would add anything to what had already begun to take shape between them. The sun hung lower in the sky now, casting long shadows that stretched out behind them, and the ranch waited somewhere beyond the rise of the land, quiet and steady, the same as it had always been, and yet not the same at all, because the path leading back to it was no longer a line walked by one person alone. It was something shared, something chosen, and as they moved forward, step by step, it became clear that whatever had started as a debt, as a memory carried across years and distance, had become something else entirely, something that did not belong to the past anymore, but to the road ahead, where neither of them knew exactly what would come next, but neither of them turned away. The road back to the ranch felt longer that afternoon, not because the distance had changed, but because something followed them now, something that did not ride beside them, but lingered behind in the form of glances, half-spoken thoughts, and the quiet weight of a town that had begun to question what it thought it understood, and Ayanna could feel it even as the buildings disappeared from view. The echo of those looks staying with her like dust on skin that would not brush off easily. The wind moved steadily across the plains, lifting strands of her hair, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant heat, and for a while, neither she nor Ethan spoke, the silence between them holding more meaning than any words could have carried, not tense, not uncertain, but full, like something still settling into its shape. After a mile or so, Ethan slowed the horse slightly, his hand steady on the reins, his gaze still forward, but his voice breaking the quiet in a way that did not disturb it. "You did not have to stand there like that," he said, not as a correction, not as a concern, just an observation offered without weight. And Ayanna turned her head slightly, her eyes tracing the line of the horizon before answering. "Neither did you," she replied, and there was something in her tone that carried a quiet understanding, something that acknowledged the choice behind his words in town without needing to name it directly. Ethan let out a small breath that might have been a laugh, though it held no humor, just recognition, and he nodded once, accepting the balance of it, the way two truths could exist side by side without needing to compete. The land rolled gently beneath them, the ranch still a distant shape against the horizon, and Ayanna's hand moved briefly to the necklace at her throat, her fingers resting there, not gripping, not holding, just feeling its presence, as if confirming something that had already been decided. "When they look at me," she said after a moment, her voice calm, steady, "they see what they expect." She paused, letting the words settle. But today, they hesitated. Ethan glanced back at her then, not fully turning, just enough to catch the edge of her expression, and there was something in his gaze that acknowledged what she had said without trying to explain it. "That is how it starts," he said quietly, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than if he had said anything more. They rode the rest of the way in that same quiet, the kind that does not need to be filled, the kind that allows space for thoughts to move and settle without interruption, and by the time the ranch came into full view, the sun had begun its descent again, casting long shadows that stretched across the land like silent markers of time. When they reached the house, Ethan dismounted first, then turned, offering his hand again, the same way he always had, consistent, unchanging, and Ayanna took it without hesitation, her feet finding the ground with a steadiness that no longer needed to be learned. The evening air was cooler now, the heat of the day fading into something softer, and they moved toward the house together, not speaking, not needing to, because the day had already said enough. Inside, the familiar quiet greeted them, the same table, the same stove, the same space that had begun to hold more than it once did, and Ayanna stepped inside first this time without waiting. Her movement natural, unforced, as if the threshold no longer needed to be crossed with caution. Ethan paused briefly at the door, his hand resting against the frame for just a moment, as if marking the shift, then followed her in, closing it behind them with a soft, final sound that settled into the room like a statement that did not need to be spoken. "They will come," Ayanna said after a while, her voice low, not fearful, just certain, and Ethan looked at her, his expression steady, Maybe, he replied, and there was no denial in it. No attempt to soften the truth, just an acceptance of what might be. Ayana nodded slightly, her gaze moving to the window where the last light was fading, and for a moment, she said nothing more, letting the thought rest where it was, not pushing it forward, not pulling away from it. And Ethan watched her, not with concern, not with expectation, just with the same quiet attention he had carried from the beginning. The fire crackled softly as he added wood to the stove, the warmth spreading slowly through the room, and Ayana moved to the table, her fingers brushing its surface, grounding herself in the familiarity of something that had begun to feel like her own. If they do, she said finally, her voice steady, I will not stand behind you. And the words were not a challenge, not a refusal, just a truth spoken clearly, and Ethan met her gaze, holding it for a moment that did not feel like a test, but like a recognition. I would not ask. You too, he said, and the quiet that followed carried something deeper than agreement, something closer to respect, the kind that does not need to be proven because it is already there. Outside, the wind moved across the plains again, steady and low, and the night settled in, wrapping the ranch in a calm that did not erase what had happened, but held it without tension. And inside, the two of them moved through the space with a quiet understanding that had grown without being forced, something shaped not by words, but by choices made and held. And as the firelight flickered against the walls, casting soft shadows that shifted and settled, it became clear that whatever the town had begun to question, whatever might come next, would not change the one thing that had already taken root between them, something quiet, something steady, something that did not need to be defended to remain true. The night did not bring rest the way it usually did, not because there was fear, but because there was a sense of something approaching, something not yet visible, but already present in the way the air held still longer than it should. And by the time the first light of morning began to stretch across the land, Ethan was already awake, standing outside near the fence, his hands resting lightly on the wood as he looked out toward the horizon where the road disappeared into a thin line of dust and distance. He did not move when Ayana stepped out behind him, her footsteps quiet against the ground, her presence felt before it was seen, and for a moment they stood there together without speaking, both of them watching the same stretch of land, as if it might reveal something before it arrived. You heard it too, she said finally, her voice low, not questioning, just certain, and Ethan nodded once, his gaze still fixed ahead. Not a sound, he replied, more like the absence of one. And there was something in that answer that carried more weight than if he had named it directly. The wind moved lightly across the plains, brushing against their clothes, carrying with it the faint scent of dust that had not yet reached them, and Ayana's hand lifted briefly to the necklace at her throat, her fingers resting there as if grounding herself in something that had already proven real. They will not come loudly, she said after a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly as she traced the line where sky met earth. People like that rarely do. And Ethan glanced at her then, not surprised by the certainty in her tone, only acknowledging it. Then we will meet them quietly, he said, and the words did not sound like preparation, they sounded like acceptance. The sun rose slowly, casting light across the land in long, pale streaks that revealed more with each passing minute. And it was not until the light fully touched the far edge of the road that the shape appeared, distant. At first, barely more than movement against the horizon, but enough to confirm what they had already known. Ayana did not step back, did not shift her stance. She simply stood, her shoulders steady, her gaze fixed on the approaching figures as they grew clearer with each second, and beside her, Ethan remained just as still, not reaching for anything, not bracing, simply present in a way that did not invite confrontation but did not avoid it either. 3, he said quietly, counting without looking away, and Ayana nodded slightly, her eyes following the same line. And one behind, she added, her voice just as calm. And the shared awareness settled between them like something that had been practiced, though neither of them had prepared for it. The riders came closer, their pace measured, not rushed, not hesitant, and as they approached the edge of the property, they slowed, the distance between them and the ranch narrowing until it was no longer something that could be ignored. The first rider stopped just short of the fence, the others falling in behind him, not forming a line, not forming anything that could be called a threat, just stopping. And for a moment, no one spoke, the silence stretching across the space like a held breath that no one wanted to break first. Ethan stepped forward then, not crossing the fence, not closing the distance completely, just enough to stand where he could be seen clearly. And Ayanna remained where she was, not behind him, not beside him, but slightly to the side, her presence visible, her posture unchanged. The man at the front of the group studied them both. His expression unreadable, not hostile, not welcoming, simply observing. And when he spoke, his voice carried easily across the short distance, steady and controlled. "We heard something in town," he said, and the words hung there, incomplete, waiting for confirmation or denial. Ethan did not respond immediately, not because he needed time, but because the truth did not require urgency. "People in town hear many things," he said finally, his tone even, and the man's gaze shifted briefly to Ayanna, then back again, as if measuring the space between what he had heard and what he now saw. "They said you bought her," the man continued, and there was no accusation in the words, just a statement, and Ayanna felt the weight of it settle in the air, not as something new, but as something that had followed them from the moment they left that place. Ethan met the man's gaze without hesitation. "They say a lot of things," he replied, and his voice did not rise, did not harden. It remained steady, grounded in something that did not need to defend itself to be understood. The man was quiet for a moment, his eyes moving once more to Ayanna, and this time, there was something different in his expression, something that had shifted since the first glance, not fully formed, not fully understood, but present, and he nodded slightly, as if acknowledging something that had not been spoken. Ayanna stepped forward then, just one step, enough to place herself fully within the space between them, not as a shield, not as a statement, but as a presence that could not be ignored. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, steady, carrying across the same distance without strain. "No one owns me," she said, and the simplicity of the words left no room for interpretation. The wind moved again, brushing through the space between them, and the man held her gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, not agreement, not approval, but recognition, and he turned his horse slightly, the others following without question, and just like that, the tension that had never fully formed began to dissolve, not into relief, but into something quieter, something that did not need to be resolved to be understood. Ethan watched them go, his posture unchanged, his gaze steady until they disappeared back along the road they had come from. And beside him, Ayanna stood just as still, her hand resting lightly against the necklace at her throat. And as the dust settled once more over the land, the ranch returned to its quiet, not as it had been before, but as something that had now been tested and had not broken. The dust settled slowly after the riders disappeared, drifting back to the ground in soft, uneven patterns that erased the last traces of their presence. And for a long moment, neither Ethan nor Ayanna moved, as if the land itself needed time to return to what it had been before, or perhaps to become something new entirely. The wind carried on, steady and indifferent, brushing past them as if nothing had happened. But the silence that followed was different now, not uncertain, not tense, but marked, like a line drawn quietly across something that could not be undone. Ethan let out a slow breath, not relief, not tension, just a release of something that had been held without effort. And he turned slightly, his gaze moving to Ayanna, not to check on her, not to measure her reaction, but to acknowledge her presence in what had just passed. And she met his look without hesitation, her posture unchanged, her hand resting lightly against the necklace as if confirming its place, its meaning, its weight. "They understood," she said quietly, her voice carrying no triumph, no surprise, just a calm recognition, and Ethan nodded once. "Enough," he replied, and the word held more than agreement. It held the understanding that not everything needed to be resolved completely to matter. They stood there a moment longer, the ranch stretching out around them, unchanged in its form but altered in something deeper, something less visible. And then Ethan turned back toward the house, his steps unhurried, as if the rhythm of the place had already begun to settle again. Ayanna followed, not because she had to, not because she was expected to, but because the movement felt natural now, Her place beside him no longer something to question, but something she had chosen without needing to say it again. Inside, the air held the same quiet warmth, the fire still alive in the stove, its soft crackle filling the space with a steady presence that asked nothing and offered everything it was. And Ayanna moved to the table, her fingers brushing the surface as she had done before, grounding herself in something that no longer felt borrowed. Ethan paused near the doorway for a moment, his hand resting against the frame, his gaze drifting briefly back toward the open land, and there was something in his expression that shifted, not visibly, not in a way that could be easily named, but in the quiet way a man carries the understanding that something has changed without needing to mark it aloud. "You did not hesitate," he said after a moment, his voice low, not as praise, not as observation, but as something closer to acknowledgement, and Ayanna looked up, her expression steady. "Neither did you," she replied, and there was no challenge in her tone, only a reflection of the truth that had already passed between them. Ethan stepped inside fully then, closing the door, with a soft motion that settled the space once more, and he moved toward the stove, adding another piece of wood to the fire, the small act grounding the moment in something familiar, something that did not require thought. "They will carry that back," he said after a while, not turning, his voice even. "To the town, to others," and Ayanna nodded slightly, her gaze thoughtful. "And it will change how they speak," she said, then after a brief pause, "Not all at once." And Ethan let out a quiet breath that might have been agreement. "No," he said, "not all at once." And the simplicity of it carried a kind of patience that neither of them needed to explain. The light outside had grown stronger now, filling the room through the window with a steady brightness that softened the edges of everything it touched, and Ayanna reached up, adjusting the necklace at her throat, not out of habit, but with a deliberate motion, as if placing it where it belonged not just on her body, but in her life. "My grandmother believed something," she said after a moment, her voice quieter now, more reflective. "She said that when people see truth clearly, even for a moment, they cannot forget it completely." Ethan turned his head slightly, listening, not interrupting, and she continued, "They may turn away, they may pretend, but it stays." The words settled into the room with a weight that did not feel heavy, but certain, and Ethan nodded slowly. "Then we gave them something to remember," he said, and there was no pride in it, no sense of accomplishment, just a quiet acceptance of what had been done. Ayanna looked at him then, really looked, and there was something in her expression that had changed, not softer, not stronger, but clearer, as if the lines that had once been drawn around her had begun to fade, replaced by something she had shaped herself. "This place," she said, her gaze moving briefly around the room, then back to him. "It is not the same as when I arrived," and Ethan followed her glance, taking in the same walls, the same table, the same space that had held his solitude for so long, and he gave a small nod. "No," he said, "it is not." And the quiet that followed carried no need for explanation, because the truth of it was already present in every small change, every shared moment, every choice that had been made without force. Outside, the wind moved again across the plains, steady and unbroken, and the ranch stood as it always had, but no longer as it had been. And inside, two people moved through the same space with a different kind of understanding, one that did not come from words alone, but from the way they had stood, the way they had chosen, the way they had remained. And as the day unfolded around them, it became clear that what had begun as something owed had become something else entirely, something that did not belong to the past anymore, but to the quiet, steady present they now shared. The days that followed did not arrive with sudden change or grand gestures. They came the way most things did on that land, slowly, quietly, almost unnoticed at first, and yet with each passing morning, something continued to settle into place, something that no longer felt fragile, no longer felt like it could be taken away by the weight of someone else's words. The ranch moved in its usual rhythm, the work steady, the hours shaped by light and shadow, and Ayanna moved within it now not as someone learning where to step, but as someone who understood the ground beneath her feet, her hands sure, her presence natural in a way that no longer required thought. Ethan noticed it in the small things, in the way she reached for tools without hesitation, in the way she read the sky before the wind shifted, in the way silence between them had become something shared rather than something to navigate, and he did not speak of it, because it did not need to be said to be known. The town, however, did not remain silent, and though no one came riding out again, their presence returned in other ways, carried on the edges of routine, in the occasional rider passing along the far road who slowed just slightly as they looked toward the ranch, in the distant figures who lingered a moment longer than necessary before moving on, and Ayanna saw it, felt it, but did not react the way she once would have. She did not turn away, did not brace herself. She simply continued, steady, unchanged, by the attention that no longer held the same power over her. One afternoon, as the sun hung high and the heat settled across the land like a quiet weight, Ethan stood near the fence, mending a loose section of wire, his movements precise, unhurried, and Ayanna worked a few yards away, her hands moving through the task with the same quiet confidence she had begun to carry, and for a while, there was nothing but the sound of wind, the soft pull of metal, the distant call of something unseen beyond the hills. Then, without announcement, a wagon appeared on the road, its wheels turning slow, deliberate, and Ethan noticed it first, not because it was unexpected, but because of the way it moved, not passing by, not continuing on, but turning slightly, just enough to shift its path toward the edge of the property. Ayanna saw it next, her gaze lifting, her posture steady, not tense, not uncertain, simply aware. And neither of them spoke as the wagon approached. The space between them filled not with fear, but with a kind of quiet readiness that did not need to be named. When the wagon reached the fence, it stopped, the man seated at the front adjusting his hat as he looked out over the land. Then toward them, his expression thoughtful, not guarded, not open, something in between, and he stepped down slowly, his boots meeting the ground with a soft, final sound that marked his arrival without forcing it. Ethan straightened from his work, setting the tool aside, not stepping forward yet, just standing where he was, and Ayanna remained where she stood, not moving closer, not stepping back, her presence steady, her hand resting lightly at her side. "I heard what happened," the man said after a moment, his voice calm, carrying across the short distance without strain, and Ethan nodded once, not asking what version of the story had reached him, not needing to. "People hear a lot of things," he replied, his tone even, and the man gave a small, almost thoughtful smile, not amused, but acknowledging the truth of it. His gaze shifted then, moving to Ayanna, not lingering in the way others had, not measuring, not questioning, just looking, and for a brief moment, something passed between them, something that did not require words to be understood, and Ayanna held his gaze without hesitation, her posture unchanged, her presence clear. "My wife," the man said after a moment, turning slightly as if the words required space to settle. "She heard it too." He paused, then added, "She said if it was true, then maybe this place was different than the others." The words hung in the air, simple, but carrying a weight that neither Ethan nor Ayanna dismissed, and Ethan tilted his head slightly, considering them. "Maybe it is," he said, not as a claim, not as a defense, just as something that had become evident without needing to be declared. The man nodded slowly, his eyes moving once more between them, and there was something in his expression that had shifted since he arrived, something quieter, something less certain, but more open than before, and he reached into the wagon, pulling out a small sack, holding it for a moment before stepping closer to the fence. "Seeds," he said, extending it slightly, not offering it as charity, not as a transaction, but as something else, something that did not fit into the patterns either of them had seen before, and Ethan looked at it, then at the man, not reaching for it immediately, not because he refused it, but because he understood what it meant, and after a moment, he stepped forward, taking it with a nod that carried no more and no less than acknowledgement. Ayanna watched this quietly, her gaze steady, and she felt something shift again, not in the land, not in the man, but in the space between what had been and what was becoming. And as the man turned back toward his wagon, climbing up without another word, the wheels beginning to move once more, she realized that the change had already begun to move beyond the boundaries of the ranch, beyond the two of them, into something wider, something slower, something that would not arrive all at once, but would not disappear either. The wagon rolled away, the dust rising behind it in soft, fading clouds, and Ethan stood for a moment longer, the sack in his hand, the weight of it more than what it contained, and Ayanna stepped closer then, not to see what it was, not to question it, but to stand beside him, the same way she had chosen to before, and as the wind moved across the plains once more, carrying the day forward without pause, it became clear that what had begun as something quiet, something small, had started to take root in ways neither of them could control, and neither of them tried to. The seasons did not change all at once, and neither did the way people spoke about what had happened, but over time, the land carried new signs of something that had taken root quietly and refused to fade, and the ranch, once a place defined by one man's silence, had become something else, something shaped by presence rather than absence, by choice rather than circumstance. The seeds the man had brought did not stay in the sack for long, and Ayanna planted them herself, her hands pressing them into the soil with a care that did not come from habit, but from understanding, and Ethan watched her without interruption, not because he had nothing to say, but because he knew that some things were not meant to be guided, only witnessed, and when the first small shoots broke through the earth weeks later, it was not a moment marked by celebration, but by a quiet acknowledgement that something had grown where nothing had been expected. The town changed slowly, not in its buildings or its routines, but in the way people paused when they spoke of that ranch, in the way certain words were no longer used as easily as before, and though some still held to what they believed, others carried something new, something that did not erase what had been, but stood beside it, making it harder to ignore the truth they had seen, even if only for a moment. Riders passed more often now, not stopping, not approaching, but not avoiding the road either, and sometimes they lifted a hand in greeting. Small gestures that meant little on their own, but together formed something that had not existed before, something that did not need to be named to be understood. Ayanna moved through her days with the same quiet steadiness she had come to carry, her presence no longer something that drew attention, but something that settled naturally into the rhythm of the place. And the necklace at her throat no longer felt like a reminder of what had been taken from her, but of what had been given back, not by chance, but by choice, by the moment she had stepped forward and spoken her own truth. Without asking permission, Ethan, for his part, did not change in the way people might have expected. He remained the same man who worked the land, who spoke only when needed, who did not seek out attention or approval. But there was something in the way he stood now. Something in the way he moved through the space that carried a quiet certainty, the kind that comes not from proving something to others, but from knowing it within himself. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky stretched wide in shades of amber and fading blue, they sat outside near the fence, the day's work behind them, the land before them open and still, and for a while, neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer something that needed to be filled, but something that held its own meaning. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Ethan asked after a while, his voice low, not because the question was heavy, but because it did not need to be asked loudly, and Ayanna turned her head slightly, considering the horizon, the line where the land met the sky, a place that always suggested distance, always suggested possibility. "I used to," she said, her voice steady. "When I thought staying meant being something I was not." She paused, her hand lifting briefly to the necklace, her fingers resting there in a gesture that had become familiar, then lowering again. "But now, staying is something I choose." Ethan nodded once, not looking at her, but understanding the weight of what she had said, not as a declaration, but as a truth that did not need to be defended. The wind moved softly across the plains, carrying with it the scent of earth and something growing, something that had taken root without force, and the ranch stood quiet, not as a place apart from the world, but as a place that had begun to shape it in small, steady ways. Ayanna looked out over the land once more, her gaze clear, her posture relaxed in a way that spoke not of ease, but of belonging, and she did not think of the circle in the town where she had once stood. She did not think of the voices that had tried to define her, because those things no longer held the same weight, they no longer had the power to shape. What came next? Ethan leaned back slightly against the fence, his eyes following the same horizon, and for a moment, he said nothing, Because there was nothing that needed to be added, nothing that needed to be explained, and in that quiet, something settled fully into place, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. Out here, where the land stretched wide and the wind carried stories farther than voices ever could, justice did not arrive with noise. It did not demand to be seen. It did not force itself into the world with weight or power. It simply stood, quiet and steady, in the space between two people who chose to see each other clearly. And in that choice, something stronger than any claim, any label, any expectation had taken hold, something that did not need to be named to be real, something that would remain long after the dust had settled and the voices had faded. Because it had never belonged to them in the first place. It had always belonged to the truth they chose to live by.